The Haunting Hour. Sarah Mitchell knew every curve and pothole of Highway 43 like the lines on her palm. 10 years of driving this route had made it as familiar as an old friend, but tonight something felt different. The familiar two-lane road cutting through dense pine forests seemed to twist differently in the unusual thickness of the fog, her headlights creating an endless tunnel of white mist that seemed to swallow everything beyond their reach. It was nearly midnight, and she was heading home after visiting her sister Claire in Burlington. They'd spent hours discussing Claire's recent divorce, and Sarah had stayed longer than planned, trying to comfort her only sibling. The radio crackled with static before dying completely, leaving her alone with the rhythmic sound of her wipers fighting against the light drizzle. She reached for her phone, no signal. Typical for this remote stretch. The memory of Claire's tearful confession about her ex-husband's betrayal still echoed in Sarah's mind when her headlights illuminated something that shouldn't be there. A figure standing motionless on the shoulder. As she drew closer, she saw it was an elderly woman in a dated floral dress, completely inappropriate for the cold October night. Sarah's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as she passed by. In her rearview mirror, the woman's head turned to follow her car, but she made no attempt to flag her down. Sarah's grandmother had always warned her about picking up strangers on this highway. There are things out there that wear human faces, she'd say, her eyes distant, as if remembering something she'd rather forget. Sarah had dismissed these warnings as the ramblings of an old woman affected by too many years of solitude. Now she wasn't so sure. 2 miles later, she saw the same woman again. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed the accelerator. This was impossible. There was no way anyone could have gotten ahead of her. The road had no turnoffs, and she hadn't seen any other vehicles. She thought about Claire, waiting for her text to confirm she'd made it home safely. The thought of her sister finding out something had happened to her on this godforsaken highway made her press the pedal harder. The third time she saw the woman, she was standing in the middle of Sarah's lane. Sarah swerved hard, her tires screaming against the wet asphalt. As she regained control, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The woman's feet weren't touching the ground. She hovered there, the hem of her floral dress swaying gently, despite the absence of wind. Her car's engine began to sputter. No, 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 she pleaded, as the dashboard lights flickered and died. The vehicle rolled to a stop, despite her desperate attempts to restart it. She was stranded in absolute darkness, with only the weak beam of her phone's flashlight for comfort. The trees on either side of the highway seemed to lean in, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers toward her car. A soft tapping came from her passenger window. "Need a ride, dear?" The voice was gentle, grandmother-like, but with an unsettling, hollow quality that made Sarah's skin crawl. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, remembering her grandmother's old superstition. Don't look at what shouldn't be there, and it can't harm you. The tapping continued, moving around the car. "I've been waiting for someone to stop for such a long time," the voice said. 50 years ago today, no one stopped for me when my car broke down. They found me 3 days later, frozen to death right here on Highway 43. Such a shame. I was on my way to see my sister too." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. How did she know about Claire? The temperature inside the car plummeted. Ice crystals began forming on the glass, creating delicate patterns that seemed to spell out words. Sarah couldn't quite read. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and her fingers began to ache from the cold. "All I want is some company," the voice whispered, now right beside Sarah's ear. "It gets so lonely out here." Your grandmother understood. She stopped for me once, 20 years ago. Such a sweet woman. She survived our little chat, but she was never quite the same after that, was she? Sarah's mind raced to her grandmother's sudden change 2 decades ago. How she'd gone from a vibrant, social woman to a recluse who refused to drive at night. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Fighting every instinct, Sarah kept her eyes forward, her trembling hands gripping the steering wheel. She began to whisper the Lord's Prayer, her voice barely audible, the same prayer her grandmother had taught her, insisting she memorize it just in case. The presence beside her grew colder, angry. "Look at me," the voice shrieked, all pretense of gentleness gone. The car shook violently. "Your grandmother looked at me. She saw what happens to those who ignore a poor old woman in need. Would you like to see too? Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, continuing to pray. The entity's rage manifested in the violent rattling of the car and the sound of scratching against the windows. Seconds stretched into minutes that felt like hours. The temperature dropped so low that Sarah could feel her tears freezing on her cheeks. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. Warmth slowly returned to the car. When Sarah finally opened her eyes, she was alone. Her car started on the first try, and the radio came back to life, playing an old country song as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. In her rearview mirror, Sarah's dark hair now had a streak of white running through it, just like her grandmother's had appeared all those years ago. She drove home in silence, hands shaking the entire way. The next morning, she searched local news archives and found a small article from 1973. Local woman frozen to death on Highway 43. The accompanying photo showed a familiar floral dress. The victim had been trying to reach her sister in Burlington when her car broke down. Sarah visited her grandmother that afternoon, finding her in her usual spot by the window. Without a word, she showed her the article. Her grandmother simply nodded, touching the white streak in her own hair that matched Sarah's new one. "She's still out there," her grandmother whispered, waiting for someone to keep her company on her last mile home. Sarah still drives that highway. She has to visit Claire, but never at night and never alone. And on cold October nights, when the fog rolls in thick, locals say you can still see a figure in a floral dress standing by the roadside, waiting for someone to stop. Some say if you look closely, you can see her sister standing beside her, wearing the same dress, waiting to welcome new company. The Mitchell women don't drive Highway 43 at night anymore. They know better. They've all seen what waits in the fog, forever trying to complete that last mile home. Now the next story will tell my small brother. Detective Michael Thompson had investigated numerous disappearances along Interstate 27 over his 15-year career with the state police, but nothing quite like this. The pattern was undeniable. Every third Friday of the month, precisely between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., a solitary vehicle would vanish without trace along the same 50-mile stretch of highway. His colleague, Dr. Rebecca Chen from the Criminal Psychology Department, had compiled extensive documentation on the 12 disappearances that occurred over the past year. The victims shared no obvious connections. Their demographics, vehicles, and travel purposes varied significantly. The only commonality was their misfortune of traveling that particular segment of I-27 during those precise hours. Tonight marked the third Friday of October, and Thompson sat in his unmarked vehicle at mile marker 237, monitoring the nearly empty highway. The digital display on his dashboard read 1:47 a.m. His department-issued radio maintained a steady stream of routine communications, while 3 backup units were strategically positioned along the highway, maintaining radio silence unless necessary. At precisely 2 a.m., a peculiar transformation began to manifest. Thompson observed the highway lights ahead systematically extinguishing, creating an advancing wall of darkness that defied the laws of electrical infrastructure. He immediately activated his dash camera and reached for his radio, but encountered only static. The darkness approached his position with methodical precision. As it engulfed his vehicle, Thompson witnessed an extraordinary transformation of the landscape. The familiar asphalt beneath his tires shifted to what appeared to be an older iteration of the highway, narrower, weathered, with faded yellow lines that hadn't been used in highway construction for decades. Through his windshield, Thompson observed something that contradicted every rational explanation. The moon, previously a waning crescent, now appeared full and occupied an impossible proportion of the sky. Its pale illumination revealed rows of vehicles lining both sides of the highway, dozens of them representing various decades, all in pristine condition despite being covered in a layer of dust that appeared to have accumulated over years. A vehicle approached from the opposite direction, a 1950s Chevrolet patrol car, its cherry light rotating silently. Thompson's training instincts prompted him to activate his own lights in response, but they remained unresponsive. The approaching vehicle slowed alongside his, and Thompson found himself staring at a uniformed officer whose appearance matched a photograph he'd examined in the department's archives. Officer James Sullivan, who vanished while investigating suspicious activity on this same highway in 1957. Sullivan's face carried an expression of both recognition and resignation. His lips moved, forming words that Thompson could somehow hear clearly, despite the closed windows. "Welcome to the night shift, Detective. We've been expecting you." Thompson attempted to start his engine, but the electrical system remained unresponsive. His cell phone displayed no signal, and the GPS unit showed coordinates that didn't correspond to any known location. Through his rear-view mirror, he observed headlights approaching, identical to the description given by the last known witness of the most recent disappearance. The subsequent investigation revealed Thompson's vehicle at mile marker 237, engine running, all systems functioning normally. However, the detective himself was never located. The dash camera footage showed only static, and the GPS data was corrupted beyond recovery. Dr. Chen's subsequent report included a curious detail. Every third Friday, precisely between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., truck drivers report seeing an unmarked police vehicle patrolling that stretch of I-27, followed by a 1950s Chevrolet patrol car. Department records indicate no units are ever dispatched during those hours. The official investigation remains open, classified as an unsolved disappearance. However, senior officers now enforce an unofficial policy. No patrol units are permitted on that 50-mile stretch during the designated hours. They claim it's due to budget constraints, but the night shift logs tell a different story. One of officers who've glimpsed their colleagues, past and present, perpetually patrolling a highway that exists somewhere between what was and what is. The most recent incident report, filed by a junior officer who disregarded the policy, described a peculiar sight. 2 patrol vehicles, one modern and one vintage, parallel to each other on opposite sides of I-27. Both officers appeared to be completing paperwork, their faces illuminated by the impossible moonlight that only appears during those specific hours. Local residents have learned to avoid that stretch of highway during the graveyard shift. They speak of a parallel patrol, operating on a frequency beyond conventional radio bands, protecting travelers from something far worse that lurks in the darkness between mile markers. Some say, if you find yourself on I-27 during those forbidden hours, you might catch a glimpse of Detective Thompson and Officer Sullivan, still maintaining their eternal vigilance, keeping watch over a highway that bridges the gap between our world and whatever lies beyond the reach of their headlights. State police records now include a discreet notation for that section of I-27. Routine maintenance scheduled between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. every third Friday. Seek alternate routes. Those who know the truth understand this bureaucratic euphemism for what it is, an acknowledgement of the officers who continue their duty long after their shifts should have ended, patrolling a beat that transcends both time and reality. Now the next story will tell my small brother, census taker, Marion Cross, didn't believe in coincidences. 15 years with the U.S. Census Bureau's Special Demographics Division had taught her that patterns always meant something. So when she noticed that Highway 371's population statistics hadn't changed since 1954. She knew she had stumbled onto something significant. Working late in the Bureau's basement archives in Washington, D.C., Marion discovered that every attempt to update the highway's demographics had failed. Census takers assigned to that stretch of road either disappeared or returned with corrupted data. Their reports, yellowed with age, contained disturbing notes about temporal inconsistencies and population anomalies. One particularly unsettling report from 1987 simply repeated the phrase, "They're still counting," for 14 pages. The Bureau's response had been bureaucratically predictable. They simply carried forward the 1954 data every decade, burying the discrepancy under layers of administrative notation. But Marion's discovery of a pattern within those original numbers revealed something impossible. The population count along Highway 371 wasn't static. It was increasing by exactly one person every month, perfectly concealed within the statistical margin of error. Her supervisor, Director Bennett, wasn't surprised when she requested the assignment. "I wondered who would notice," he said, sliding a file across his desk. "Every generation, someone in the Bureau spots the pattern. They all insist on investigating personally." He paused, studying her with tired eyes. "None of them ever file a second report." The rental car's dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. as Marion turned onto Highway 371. The Bureau's file had specified that demographic anomalies only manifested between midnight and 4 a.m., a detail that appeared in every report since 1954. The night was unusually clear for October, the stars sharp and cold against the black sky. Her research equipment occupied the passenger seat. Thermal cameras, electromagnetic sensors, and the Bureau's specialized census-taking kit. The latter contained technologies the public didn't know existed, designed to count populations that preferred to remain uncounted. At precisely midnight, her car's electronics failed simultaneously. The engine continued running, but every digital display went dark. Even her phone showed no signal, its screen displaying only an endlessly loading sensors database sync notification. The highway ahead seemed to stretch and compress in impossible ways. Road signs appeared at irregular intervals, showing distances that defied geometric logic. A marker would indicate 50 miles to Cooper's Junction, and the next sign, merely yards later, would show 72 miles to the same destination. Marion activated the Bureau's specialized equipment, designed to count populations through various dimensional phases. The readings made no sense. According to the devices, she was simultaneously encountering thousands of people, yet the highway remained empty. The first anomaly appeared at 1:17 a.m. Through her windshield, Marion observed a vehicle approaching from the opposite direction, a 1954 Ford Custom Line, pristine despite its age. As it passed, she glimpsed the driver, a man in a Census Bureau uniform, his face locked in an expression of perpetual concentration, endlessly counting. More vehicles began to appear, each from a different era, their drivers all Bureau employees. Marion recognized some from the photographs in missing persons reports she'd studied. They all drove with the same focused expression, some mumbling numbers, others making tally marks in endless ledgers. Her census equipment began registering impossible data. According to the readings, she was documenting a population that existed in multiple temporal planes simultaneously. Each vehicle contained not just its driver, but thousands of quantum variations of the same person, all counting, all trying to document a population that grew exponentially across dimensions. At 2:34 a.m., she saw herself drive past in a car identical to her rental. The other, Marion, turned and nodded, her dashboard illuminated by the glow of census equipment, showing the same impossible readings. Then another Marion passed, and another, each slightly different, each conducting their own count. The truth revealed itself through her data. Highway 371 wasn't just a road, it was a temporal anomaly that trapped census takers in an endless loop of documentation. Each attempt to count its population created new iterations of the counter, which then needed to be counted, spawning more counters in an infinite recursive sequence. The highway had become a closed system of perpetual enumeration, a place where the act of measuring the population automatically increased it. Every census taker who noticed the pattern was drawn to investigate, becoming part of the phenomenon they sought to document. Marion understood now why the 1954 numbers had been carried forward. That year marked the first attempt to use the Bureau's specialized equipment on Highway 371, creating a cascade of temporal duplications that could never be accurately counted. The Bureau hadn't been hiding the truth. They simply had no protocol for documenting an infinite population of census takers counting themselves. At 3:47 a.m., Marion pulled onto the shoulder, her census equipment overloading from the impossible calculations. Through her windows, she watched versions of herself drive past, each drawn by the same pattern, each destined to join the eternal count. She had a choice. The logical response would be to leave, to file a report recommending Highway 371 be removed from future census routes. But she knew the pattern couldn't be broken that easily. As long as the highway existed in any database, some census taker would notice the irregularity and investigate. Marion activated her final piece of equipment, a prototype designed to measure populations across all possible temporal variations simultaneously. As the device powered up, she understood its true purpose. Director Bennett hadn't given it to her to count the highway's population. He'd given it to her to become part of it. The device's display showed a single number, infinity plus 1. The next morning, a state trooper found an abandoned rental car on Highway 371. The vehicle's interior was filled with census equipment displaying impossible readings. Marion Cross was never found, but her preliminary report was uploaded to the Bureau's database at exactly midnight. Highway 371 Population Census Update, October 2024. Total population. Error. Stack overflow. Notes. The count continues. We are all still counting. Recommendation: maintain 1954 baseline numbers for future reports. Additional documentation: look for us in the midnight traffic. Final status: census ongoing. Director Bennett filed the report without comment, adding it to a drawer full of similar documents. That evening, he updated Highway 371's official population count, carefully maintaining the illusion of static numbers that had kept the temporal loop contained for 70 years. State Department of Transportation records now include a curious regulation. Highway 371 maintenance crews are prohibited from working between midnight and 4 a.m. Official documentation cites unusual traffic patterns as the reason, but maintenance supervisors tell their crews the truth. During those hours, the highway belongs to the census takers. Local residents have learned to avoid Highway 371 after midnight. They speak of endless lines of vehicles, their drivers focused on impossible calculations, eternally documenting a population that includes themselves. Truckers report seeing the same car pass them multiple times, each instance driven by the same woman surrounded by census equipment, endlessly counting. The Bureau's Special Demographics Division still assigns new employees to analyze Highway 371's population data. They know that eventually, someone will notice the pattern hidden in the numbers. Someone will request the assignment. Someone will join the midnight count. Every month, the highway's true population increases by exactly one person. In the Bureau's basement archives, a growing collection of preliminary reports tells the same story. Of census takers drawn to an impossible count. Of a highway that turned documentation into infinity. Of a population that can never be fully enumerated because the very act of counting becomes part of what must be counted. And on clear nights, when the stars are sharp and cold against the black sky, drivers on Highway 371 report seeing flashes of light from census equipment in passing cars. If they look carefully, they might glimpse Marion Cross, surrounded by versions of herself from every possible timeline, all focused on their eternal task. Counting a population that grows with each attempt to count it. Documenting a census that can never be completed. The count continues, and somewhere in the Bureau's databases, a number increases by 1, hidden in the margin of error, waiting for the next census taker to notice the pattern and join the midnight shift on Highway 371. No, I don't have another brother. Have some shame, guys.